The day after the hurricane, I was told my house would have to wait. Not because it was worse than the others, but because I was a conflict. By noon, my name disappeared from the HOA email list. By sunset, my claim was marked low priority. I was still answering calls from neighbors whose roofs were already being fixed. Someone had moved my file to the wrong folder. They said it was nothing. It wasn't. Everything I believed about fairness was about to stop working. The day after the hurricane, I was told my house would have to wait. Not because it was destroyed beyond repair, not because the damage was minor, but because, as one email put it, I was a conflict. I read that word at 6:17 a.m., standing barefoot in my kitchen, water still pooled under the refrigerator, the smell of damp drywall hanging in the air. My phone buzzed once, then again. An automated system update. My claim status had changed overnight. Low priority. Review pending. By the time I poured my first cup of coffee, my name was gone from the HOA email thread. No warning, no explanation, just silence where my name used to be. I noticed it because the emails kept coming updates about temporary dumpsters, curbside debris pickup, which contractors were approved to work in the neighborhood. I could see the replies stacking up. I just wasn't on them anymore. At 8:03 a.m., I logged into the company system and started my shift. I was still answering calls from neighbors whose roofs were already being tarped, whose drywall crews were scheduled for the next day. I walked them through deductibles. I explained depreciation. I told them where to upload photos. I used the same calm voice I always used, the one trained into me after years of handling disaster claims across the Gulf Coast. At 9:40 a.m., Mrs. Keller, from 3 streets over, thanked me for pushing her file through. I hadn't touched her file. At 10:15, I noticed something small and strange. My claim number, the one tied to my address, had been moved into a folder labeled External Review. That folder wasn't for damaged houses. It was for lawsuits, fraud investigations, people trying to game the system. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed the screen and took the next call. I've lived in this town for 11 years, long enough to know how things work, long enough to know when something is being done quietly, on purpose, with everyone pretending it's procedural, long enough to know not to ask questions too early. The hurricane had come in just after midnight, loud and fast, the kind that rattles windows before you even understand what you're hearing. I spent most of the night in the hallway with a flashlight, and my dog pressed against my legs, listening to the roof groan and the wind throw things that had names once: patio furniture, trash cans, a neighbor's kayak into the darkness. By morning, the street looked like it had been picked up and shaken, power lines down, palm fronds everywhere. The corner house had lost half its roof. Mine had taken water through the attic and into the walls, enough to warp the floors and turn the living room ceiling a soft, dangerous yellow. Not catastrophic, just enough to matter. When I stepped outside that morning, people were already out, moving with purpose, families in matching t-shirts, pickup trucks with ladders, coolers of bottled water. Someone had set up a folding table near the mailboxes with coffee and pastries. I waved. A few people nodded back. No one stopped. At noon, I drove to the HOA office to ask about the debris schedule. The door was open. The air conditioning was blasting. Inside, 3 board members sat around the conference table, papers spread out, phones face down. They looked up when I walked in. There was a pause. Not a dramatic one. Just half a second too long. "Oh," one of them said. "Hey." I said my name, even though I didn't need to. I asked about the debris pickup for my block. Another pause, a glance exchanged. Then, "We'll have to get back to you." That was when I understood something had shifted. I left without pushing. I've learned the hard way that when people stop making eye contact, it's because they've already decided something. You just weren't invited to the meeting where it happened. By late afternoon, the rumor had found its way back to me. "You're kind of in a weird position," a neighbor said, leaning against her car, arms crossed like she was cold even though it was 90 degrees. "You know, with your job and everything." I asked her what she meant. She shrugged. "It's just complicated." That word again. I work as an insurance claims adjuster. Have for almost 15 years. I started out handling fender benders in Ohio, worked my way through property claims, then specialized in catastrophe response. Floods, fires, hurricanes. I know the regulations. I know the ethics rules. I know exactly where the line is. And I know that nothing I had done crossed it. But the perception was enough. Perception always is. My ex-husband's family owns 6 rental properties in this neighborhood, 2 more just outside the HOA boundary. His brother sits on the board. His cousin handles community outreach. His uncle owns the construction company that somehow always ends up with the biggest contracts after storms. We'd been divorced for 3 years. No kids. Clean break, at least on paper. But paper doesn't erase networks. That evening, my ex called. His name flashed on my screen while I was standing in the shower, trying to rinse fiberglass insulation out of my hair. I let it ring until it stopped. Then I wrapped myself in a towel and sat on the edge of the tub, phone in my hand, water dripping onto the floor. He texted, "Hey, I heard things are tense. Don't take it personally." I stared at the message. Then another one came in. "It's just not a great look right now." I typed 3 different responses, deleted all of them. I didn't ask him to fix anything. I didn't ask him to speak up. I didn't ask him why my name had disappeared overnight. I already knew the answer. At 7:32 p.m., I received a formal notice from my company. Not a termination. Not even a warning. Just a reassignment. Effective immediately, I was being moved off local claims and onto a remote review queue to avoid potential conflicts. Temporary, indefinite, polite. The kind of email written by someone who knows exactly how to protect themselves. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the generator across the street. The Keller house glowed like a ship at sea. Mine stayed black. Sometime around midnight, I walked into the living room and took photos of the damage. The ceiling, the warped floorboards, the soaked baseboards along the wall. I uploaded them. Then, almost without thinking, I forwarded the confirmation email to my personal account. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit. When you work disasters long enough, you learn that memory is fragile. Systems change, files move. People forget conversations they swore they had. Receipts don't forget. The next morning, a contractor truck pulled up in front of the Keller house. Then another at the corner property owned by my ex's uncle. Ladders came down. Hammers started up. At Neo, Arton, A. My claim status refreshed again. Still low priority. Still under review. Still waiting. I made myself breakfast. I fed the dog. I logged into work. At 11:06 a.m., an internal email crossed my screen by mistake. It wasn't addressed to me. I don't think anyone realized I could see it. A list of addresses. Adjusted valuations. Priority flags. I recognized half the names. I didn't screenshot it. I didn't forward it. I just noted the time. At 2:41 p.m., someone moved my file again. This time, into a folder labeled inactive. I closed my laptop. I stood up. I looked around my house, the boxes stacked against the wall, the wet spots I'd circled in blue tape, the quiet where normal life was supposed to be. And for the first time since the storm, I understood the cost. Not the deductible. Not the repairs. The cost of being inconvenient in a place that only works when everyone stays in their assigned role. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know who else was involved. I only knew one thing with absolute clarity. Everything I believed about how this system worked, about fairness, procedure, and doing the right thing was already cracking. And it was going to break somewhere I hadn't expected. By the 3rd day after the storm, the town had settled into its version of normal. Chainsaws started up at sunrise. Pickup trucks idled at every corner. Someone had spray-painted OK on the side of the fire station. The diner on Main Street reopened with a limited menu and a handwritten sign taped to the door. Cash only. Be patient. I drove there that morning because it was the one place I could sit without feeling like I was trespassing in my own life. The waitress recognized me. She always did. I ordered eggs and toast, black coffee. She didn't ask follow-up questions. She just nodded and wrote it down, the way people do when they've learned not to pull at loose threads. From my booth by the window, I watched the town move. People hugged. People pointed at roofs. People compared damage like trading cards. Everyone had a story about where they were when the wind picked up, what they grabbed before the lights went out. I noticed something else, too. No one asked about my house. Not once. I'd been part of this place long enough to know what that meant. Concern wasn't withheld by accident, it was rationed. After breakfast, I drove home the long way, past the inlet and the row of rental houses my ex's family owned. Blue tarps stretched across their roofs like neat uniforms. A crew was already hauling debris to the curb. Someone had brought them a cooler full of ice. I parked in my driveway and sat there for a minute with the engine running, hands on the wheel, watching a contractor step over my lawn without looking at me. I remembered the first time I'd come to this neighborhood. 11 years ago, I'd driven down from Atlanta in a car packed with boxes and a borrowed mattress, following a man I thought I'd spend my life with. He'd talked about this town like it was a living thing. Close-knit, honest, the kind of place where people showed up when it mattered. And they did. Just not for everyone. Back then, I worked my first hurricane season out of a temporary FEMA office in Louisiana. 12-hour days, motel rooms that smelled like bleach. I learned how to talk to people who had lost everything without making promises I couldn't keep. I learned how to listen. That skill carried me here, helped me integrate, made me useful. For a long time, that was enough. The problems didn't start when I got divorced. That was just the moment they stopped pretending things were neutral. My ex moved out quietly. No scene, no shouting in the street. He took his things, shook my hand like we were closing a deal, and told me he hoped we could stay amicable. What he meant was, don't make this hard. For a while, I didn't. I stayed in the house because it made sense financially. I kept attending HOA meetings even after he stopped. I volunteered at cleanups. I brought cookies to board elections I wasn't allowed to vote in anymore because my name wasn't on the deed. I was useful without being threatening. Then the hurricane came, and usefulness shifted. At 10:12 a.m., I logged into my reassigned queue. The files were from 3 states away: flood damage in Iowa, hail claims in Oklahoma. Nothing tied to my zip code. It was like being erased without being fired. A message popped up from my supervisor. Polite, sympathetic, empty. This is just temporary. Let's let things cool down. Cool down. As if storms respected that. At noon, I got a call from a woman named Carla who lived 2 blocks over. Her voice shook as she described water pouring through her ceiling fan. I don't know who else to call, she said. They told me you were the best. I closed my eyes. I explained, carefully, that I wasn't handling local claims anymore, that she needed to go through the general intake line. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, she said. I didn't realize. I could hear it then. The recalibration, the mental adjustment people make when they realize you're no longer who they thought you were. I'm sorry to bother you, she added quickly. I didn't mean to put you in a weird spot. After we hung up, I sat there staring at the wall, listening to the faint drip of water from the ceiling into the bucket I'd placed under the leak. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was cataloging. That afternoon, I pulled out a notebook I hadn't used in years, the kind with a stiff black cover and blank pages. I wrote the date at the top. Then I wrote down what I knew, not what I felt. Times, file movements, conversations, exact phrases. Nothing dramatic, just facts. At 3:26 p.m., an HOA board member drove by my house slowly, then circled the block. At 4:11 p.m., my claim status refreshed without notification. At 4:13.20 p.m., a contractor left a flyer on my door advertising priority storm repairs, then crossed the street and knocked on my neighbor's door. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't post online. I didn't call a lawyer. That would come later, if it came at all. Right now, I needed to understand the shape of what was happening. That evening, the town held a community meeting at the high school gym. Generators hummed outside. Folding chairs filled the basketball court. A banner read "Stronger Together." I almost didn't go. But then I remembered something I'd learned early in this job. Decisions are rarely made in the room. They're confirmed there. So I went. I sat near the back, next to a woman I recognized from yoga class. She smiled politely, then turned back to her phone. The HOA president stood at the microphone and thanked everyone for their patience. He praised the contractors. He praised the volunteers. He praised the spirit of the community. When it came time for questions, hands shot up. People asked about debris timelines, about insurance reimbursements, about whether FEMA would be setting up a temporary office nearby. Someone asked about prioritization. The president nodded gravely. "We're doing everything by the book," he said. "We have to be careful about conflicts of interest." There it was again. No name, no accusation, just a concept hanging in the air, heavy enough to settle on me without ever being spoken aloud. I felt eyes flicker in my direction, then away. After the meeting, I stood near the exit, watching people cluster into familiar groups. No one approached me. As I turned to leave, I heard my ex's brother laugh. A hand clapped him on the back. Someone mentioned permits. I stepped out into the humid night and breathed in deeply. Back at home, I packed a small bag, clothes, laptop, the notebook, my dog's leash. I wasn't running. I was repositioning. I emailed HR and requested a transfer to the Federal Disaster Review Team. I'd worked with them before, long hours, no local politics, clear lines. I didn't justify it. I didn't complain. I just asked. The reply came an hour later. Approved. Effective immediately. I sat on the edge of the bed and let that sink in. For the first time since the storm, something moved because I moved it. Before sleep, I walked through the house one last time. I took photos of everything again. The ceiling, the walls, the floor. Then I did something small and strange, something I didn't fully understand the impulse for at the time. I wrote my name on a piece of blue tape and stuck it to the front of the notebook. Ownership, I thought, even if only in my own hands. As I turned off the light, my phone buzzed. A text from my ex. "People are asking questions. Might be good to talk." I set the phone face down. Outside, the generators droned. Across the street, lights glowed. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted through the open air. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling I couldn't yet fix, and felt something solid settle in my chest. I wasn't being pushed out because I'd done something wrong. I was being pushed out because I no longer fit neatly into the story they told themselves about how this place worked. And once I saw that, I understood something else. This wasn't about my house. It was about who got to decide what counted and who didn't. That question was bigger than this town. And I was finally standing in the right place to watch the answer unfold. The first thing that changed when I joined the Federal Disaster Review Team was the silence. No neighborhood gossip, no familiar names popping up in subject lines, no one asking where I lived or who I knew. The files came stripped of context, reduced to numbers, photos, timestamps, satellite overlays. Damage was damage. Policy language was policy language. It was clean in a way local work never was. I worked from a borrowed desk in my half-dark living room, the ceiling still stained and sagging above me. The internet flickered on and off, but the hotspot held. Every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., the system logged me in automatically. Every evening at 6 p.m., it logged me out. No exceptions. For the first few days, I told myself I was relieved. I didn't have to see anyone. I didn't have to wonder whether a smile meant anything. I could focus on what I'd always been good at, reading damage patterns, matching them to policy language, flagging discrepancies that didn't sit right. But relief has a way of turning into distance. On the fourth day, I drove past my old office for the first time since the reassignment. The parking lot was full. Someone had taped a handwritten, "Thank you adjusters" sign to the front door. I didn't stop. At home, the repairs still hadn't started. My claim sat untouched, the status unchanged. Inactive. I told myself it didn't matter. I had enough savings to cover temporary fixes. I could replace drywall later. Floors could wait. Still, every time I stepped over the warped boards in the hallway, something tightened in my chest. Late Tuesday afternoon, my first local file crossed my new desk by accident. I noticed the zip code immediately. Same coastal region, same storm. The address wasn't mine, but it was close enough that I could picture the street without trying. The system flagged it as part of a random audit sample. Nothing special, just one of hundreds pulled for secondary review. I opened it. The damage estimate was high, higher than it should have been. given the photos. Roof loss claimed where the satellite imagery showed intact shingles. Interior water damage listed for rooms that appeared untouched. I scrolled slowly, methodically. Contractor name, familiar. Adjuster notes, brief, vague, unusually generous. I felt a flicker of something recognition. Maybe, but I didn't act on it. One file doesn't mean anything, patterns do. I flagged it for further review and moved on. By the end of the week, 3 more came through. Different addresses, same contractor, same inflated valuations, same adjuster initials. I checked the timestamps. All approved within hours of submission. No follow-up questions. No second inspections. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't fraud. Not in the dramatic sense people imagine when they hear the word. No fake houses. No staged fires. This was something quieter. Preferential math. The kind that adds up slowly, invisibly, until someone decides to look. I added a note in my notebook. Just the file numbers. Just the dates. No conclusions. Saturday morning, my ex showed up at my door. I hadn't heard his car over the generators, but I heard the knock. 3 short raps, like he expected to be let in. I opened the door enough to stand in the frame, blocking his view inside. He looked tired, sunburned, like someone who'd been busy but not personally affected. "We need to talk," he said. I waited. "This whole thing," he gestured vaguely toward the neighborhood. "It's getting messy." I told him I was busy. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't have to escalate." I almost laughed. "I didn't do anything," I said. He shifted his weight. "You asked for a transfer." That sent a signal. I looked past him, down the street. Another contractor truck pulled up. Another ladder went up. Still not at my house. "What signal?" I asked. "That you're not on board," he said. "That you're going to make things harder than they need to be." I met his eyes then. "Harder for who?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower. "For everyone." I nodded once. "Then you should have thought about that before you let them erase me," I said. His jaw tightened. "This isn't personal." I stepped back and closed the door. That night, I dreamed of spreadsheets. Columns sliding out of alignment, numbers changing when I wasn't looking. On Monday, the audit queue doubled. A new directive came down from above. Expanded review for storm-related claims in select coastal regions. My region. I read it twice, careful to note the language. No accusations, no targets, just process. By Wednesday, the pattern was undeniable. Same neighborhoods, same contractors, same expedited approvals, same people benefiting from the same shortcuts. And the inverse, too. Claims delayed, reduced, marked non-urgent. I saw my own house in the margins of the data, a dot among many. Not unique, just part of a group that didn't fit. That was the part that stayed with me. This wasn't about punishing me. I wasn't special enough for that. I was collateral. On Thursday afternoon, my supervisor requested a call. She appeared on screen in a neutral office, walls bare, expression unreadable. "You've been thorough," she said. "We appreciate that." I waited. "We're expanding the audit," she continued. "There will be questions." "From who?" I asked. "Local officials, contractors, possibly homeowners." I nodded. "And my role?" "Continue exactly as you are," she said. "Do not communicate outside the system. Do not speculate." I almost smiled. For the first time since the storm, the rules were clear. That evening, my phone buzzed nonstop. Numbers I recognized, numbers I didn't. I let them go to voicemail. One message stood out. From a board member. "We're hearing some concerning things. If there's an issue, we should address it internally." Internally. I deleted the message. At 11:14 p.m., an email notification lit up my screen. A mass message to the HOA. Subject: Clarification on claims process. I wasn't copied, but someone forwarded it to me anyway. The language was careful, reassuring, emphasizing transparency, fairness, cooperation. It read like a press release written by someone who knew exactly what was coming. I shut down my computer and stepped outside. The night air was thick, salty. Across the street, the Keller house was fully lit now, repairs nearly complete. I looked at my own dark windows. For a moment, something like doubt crept in. A quiet voice asking whether this was worth it. Whether I should have kept my head down. Whether staying useful would have been easier. Then I remembered the folder marked inactive. I remembered my name disappearing without explanation. And I understood something else. If I had stayed, nothing would have changed. Not for me. Not for anyone else whose house didn't belong to the right story. The audit wasn't my revenge. It was a mirror, and once held up, it couldn't be taken back. Inside, I opened the notebook and added a final line for the day. They think this is about me. I capped the pen and set it down carefully. It never was. Somewhere beyond my quiet street, a system was beginning to notice its own reflection. And I was no longer standing in the way. By the second week after the storm, the town stopped pretending things were temporary. The generators were still running, but the urgency had softened. People complained about noise instead of damage. Restaurants posted photos of reopened patios. Someone hung new string lights across a porch that hadn't existed before the hurricane. Recovery, in this place, didn't mean returning to what was lost. It meant restoring the hierarchy. My house remained exactly as it was. The ceiling stain had darkened at the edges, spreading like a slow bruise. The bucket under the drip filled overnight if it rained, which it did almost every afternoon. I learned to step over the warped floorboards without looking down, the way you learn to walk past a mirror when you don't want to see yourself. Each morning, I logged into the federal system and worked my queue. Each afternoon, I took notes, quietly, precisely, and each evening, the pressure around me increased, not loudly, not directly, but in the way people apply pressure when they want deniability. It started with favors. A contractor I recognized called my personal phone and left a voicemail. Friendly, casual. He said he was just checking in, wanted to make sure I was okay after the storm, mentioned that he had availability if I needed work done fast. He didn't say anything about claims. He didn't have to. I didn't call him back. The next day, a woman from the HOA knocked on my door. She brought a laminated flyer about mold prevention and stood too close, smiling the whole time. "We're trying to make sure everyone stays informed," she said, "especially given your situation." I asked her what she meant. She waved a hand. "You know, your professional background. People are sensitive." I thanked her and closed the door. At work, the audit expanded again. More files, more data. The same pattern repeating itself with mechanical consistency. The numbers didn't spike dramatically. That would have been suspicious. They drifted upward in increments, just small enough to escape notice unless you were trained to look for it, which I was. I built a spreadsheet separate from the system. Dates, addresses, adjusters, contractors, approval times. Still no conclusions, just facts. Midweek, my supervisor sent another message. "Be aware that local representatives may reach out. Maintain protocol." Within an hour, someone did. A call from a city office number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was smooth, practiced. They wanted to touch base, to make sure I felt supported, to remind me that the community valued transparency and cooperation. They ended with an invitation to coffee. I deleted it. That night, my ex texted again. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I stared at the words for a long time before replying. "For who?" 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "For people who didn't do anything wrong." I put the phone down. The next morning, I woke up to a notice taped to my front door. Violation. Unapproved debris placement. Apparently, the pile of ruined drywall I'd stacked neatly by the curb was too close to the sidewalk. I had 24 hours to move it or face a fine. Across the street, debris twice the size sat untouched. I took a photo of the notice. Then another of the neighboring piles. I wrote down the time. Still no confrontation. Still no reaction. That afternoon, a new file appeared in my audit queue. Same contractor, same neighborhood. This one stood out immediately. The homeowner had submitted photos clearly showing minimal damage. Yet the approved payout was among the highest I'd seen. I pulled the metadata. The inspection had been logged at 6:12 a.m. before daylight, before access roads were fully cleared. No photos of the inspector on site, no secondary verification. I flagged it. 5 minutes later, the system locked the file. A red banner appeared. Supervisor review required. I leaned back in my chair, heart steady, mind sharp. Someone had noticed me noticing. An hour later, my supervisor called again. "This is where things get delicate," she said. I listened. "We're not accusing anyone," she continued. "But there's concern that your proximity to the area could be influencing your perspective." There it was, clean, professional, almost kind. "I'm following the data," I said. "I know," she replied. "Just be mindful of how it might be perceived." Perception again. After we hung up, I closed the system and stared at my reflection in the dark screen. I looked tired, older than I felt, like someone who had been quietly carrying weight without realizing how heavy it had become. That evening, I went for a walk. The neighborhood looked different now. Finished, polished, lawns trimmed, fresh shingles gleaming under porch lights. People waved as I passed. Some smiled too brightly, others looked away. Near the community mailbox, 2 women stopped talking when they saw me. One of them lowered her voice, though I couldn't hear what she said. I kept walking. Halfway down the block, I noticed something small and strange. My name had been removed from the emergency contact list, taped inside the mailbox shelter. I knew because I'd been on it before. I remembered the way my handwriting curved slightly on the laminated sheet. Now, there was a blank space. No explanation, no announcement, just absence. I stood there longer than necessary, fingers resting on the cool metal, and felt something shift. Not anger. Clarity. This wasn't about insurance, or ethics, or storms. It was about compliance. I was supposed to understand the message by now, to step back, to stop looking too closely, to accept that belonging here came with conditions. That night, I pulled the notebook out again and reread everything I'd written so far. Dates, times, names, small humiliations stacked neatly beside financial discrepancies. 2 columns, one personal, one systemic. They were starting to overlap. On Friday morning, the audit directive changed. Federal oversight would be increasing. On-site reviews scheduled. External analysts brought in. The language was still neutral, but the shift was unmistakable. Within hours, my phone started buzzing again. Missed calls, texts, emails forwarded from people who suddenly remembered I existed. One message came from my ex's uncle. "We should clear the air." Another from a board member. "Let's handle this like adults." I didn't respond. That afternoon, a truck finally pulled into my driveway. For a moment, my heart jumped. I stood at the window, watching as the driver got out. It wasn't a repair crew. It was a code enforcement officer. He handed me a clipboard and pointed to a section of my siding. "Potential mold hazard," he said. "We'll need documentation." I asked him if he'd been to any other houses on the block. He hesitated. I was assigned this address. Assigned. After he left, I sat on the front steps and laughed. Not loudly, just a short, surprised sound that escaped before I could stop it. They weren't trying to fix the problem. They were trying to exhaust me. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether this would pass. It wouldn't. Systems like this don't correct themselves quietly. They apply pressure until the outlier either conforms or disappears. I wasn't conforming, and I wasn't disappearing. That evening, I received a secure message through the federal portal. A request. They wanted my documentation. All of it. The personal notes, the file numbers, the timestamps. Not as evidence, as context. I sat very still, reading the message again and again. Then I opened the notebook and began scanning each page carefully, methodically. As I worked, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the storm. Relief. Not because this was ending, but because it was finally becoming what it had always been. Not a personal dispute. Not a neighborhood feud. But a question big enough to stand on its own. Who gets protected when no one is watching? I attached the files. I added no commentary. When I hit send, there was no dramatic music, no sense of victory. Just a quiet certainty settling into place. Outside, the lights across the street glowed warm and steady. My house remained dark, but for the first time since the hurricane, the imbalance made sense. And once something makes sense, it becomes very difficult to ignore. The first official request from the Federal Review Team arrived early Monday morning. Not a demand, not a subpoena, just a clean, carefully worded message asking for clarification on several files I had flagged, along with any supplementary materials I believed were relevant. The kind of request that assumes you already understand the weight of what you're holding. I made coffee and sat at the small table by the window, laptop open, notebook beside it. Outside, a contractor's truck idled across the street, engine rumbling low. Someone laughed. A hammer struck metal. Life continued. Inside, I opened the first file. Address, claim number, timeline. I'd looked at these details dozens of times already, but now I forced myself to slow down, to read as if I were seeing them for the first time, to strip away my own story and let the data stand on its own. The damage assessment had been approved in under 3 hours. No secondary inspection. No weather verification beyond a generic storm code. The payout exceeded comparable claims on the same block by nearly 40%. I cross-referenced it with satellite imagery, with time-stamped photos pulled from public databases, with contractor invoices. Then I moved to the next file. And the next? By mid-morning, a shape had emerged clear enough that I could describe it without emotion, without speculation. Certain homes were being treated as if loss were assumed. Others, as if loss had to be proven twice. At 11:22 a.m., I received a message from my supervisor. "Thank you. Please continue." No commentary, no encouragement, just permission. Around noon, my ex called again. This time, I answered. He sounded irritated before I even said hello. "Why didn't you tell me this was going federal?" he asked. I leaned back in my chair. "Because it didn't involve you." A pause. "It involves a lot of people," he said. "People you know." "I know," I replied. "You're putting everyone in a bad position," he continued. "This could have been handled quietly." I looked at the notebook, at the neat columns of dates and numbers, at the blue tape with my name written on it, slightly crooked. "It was handled quietly," I said. "Just not in your favor." He exhaled sharply. "You're acting like this is some moral crusade." I didn't answer right away. "I'm acting like this is my job," I said finally. He laughed, short and disbelieving. "You don't have to be like this." "Like what? Competent? Uncooperative? Unwilling to disappear?" I ended the call without responding. That afternoon, a new email hit my inbox, this one not forwarded, not accidental. It was addressed to me directly. From the HOA president. The subject line read, "Concern." The body was brief. "We're hearing rumors that could be damaging to the community. If there's an issue, we'd prefer to resolve it internally rather than escalate unnecessarily." I read it twice. Then I archived it. At 3:18 p.m., the first real consequence landed. One of the files I had flagged earlier was removed from the audit queue entirely. The system logged the change as a clerical correction. I checked the user ID attached to the action. Local administrator. I didn't panic. I didn't rush. I opened my notebook and wrote down the time, the file number, the user ID. Then I pulled the metadata I'd already saved. Once you know to expect interference, it stops feeling personal. It becomes another data point. That evening, as I was scanning documents, I noticed something I hadn't before. Several of the inflated claims shared a common feature: expedited approvals tied to temporary housing urgency. A clause designed to help families displaced by storms. I checked the addresses again. None of those homeowners had vacated their properties. I pulled utility usage records, public information, electric meters, water flow, lights on, water running, normal consumption. The clause had been used anyway, not fraud. Just generosity, applied selectively. At 8:47 p.m., I received a secure message from the federal team. "Please include any observations related to expedited housing clauses." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I added a new column to my spreadsheet. That night, I dreamed of my house finally being repaired. Not restored, repaired. Patches visible. Colors mismatched. Imperfect but livable. When I woke up, the ceiling was still stained. The bucket still half full. The next day, the town newsletter landed in my inbox. I wasn't on the official mailing list anymore, but someone forwarded it to me with a single line. "Thought you should see this." The headline read, Community comes together after the storm. There was a photo of the HOA board smiling in front of the rebuilt community center. My ex stood just off to the side, arms crossed, looking proud. No mention of audits, no mention of delays, no mention of the homes still waiting. I scrolled to the bottom. There, in small print, was a paragraph about ongoing reviews and cooperation with external agencies. The tone was calm, reassuring, prepared. I closed the email. By Thursday, the pressure shifted again. This time, it came from my employer. A formal request to document my personal connection to the area. Not an accusation, a form. I filled it out carefully. Yes, I lived there. Yes, I had a pending claim. Yes, I had disclosed this at the start of the audit. I attached timestamps. I attached emails. I attached the original reassignment notice. I sent it off and waited. That afternoon, a package arrived at my door. No return address. Inside was a branded hoodie from a local contractor, one of the names that appeared repeatedly in my spreadsheet. A size too small. I stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and placed it back in the box. I didn't keep it. I didn't throw it away. I photographed it. Then I dropped it off at a donation center 2 towns over, receipt in hand. On Friday morning, the audit team scheduled a virtual briefing. No cameras, no small talk, just a list of questions. They asked about approval timelines, about contractor selection, about the use of emergency clauses. They did not ask about my house. They did not ask about the HOA. They did not ask about my ex. That was when I understood the shift. My story had become irrelevant. The system no longer needed my context. It needed my data. And data doesn't care who you upset. After the call, I sat quietly for a long time, hands resting on the table, feeling something I hadn't expected. Grief. Not for my marriage. Not for the town. For the version of myself who had believed that being fair would make things fair. That night, the power flickered across the street but held. Laughter drifted through open windows. A grill flared to life. I ate dinner standing up, plate balanced in one hand, listening to the steady drip from the ceiling. My phone buzzed. A message from my ex's cousin. "This is getting out of hand." I typed a reply, then erased it. There was nothing left to say. Later, as I was locking up for the night, I noticed something small and almost absurd. The violation notice taped to my door earlier in the week had been removed. No explanation. No follow-up. Just gone. I smiled then. Not because it mattered, but because it confirmed what I already knew. They were adjusting. Reacting. The balance had shifted, even if they didn't yet understand how far. Before bed, I added one last line to the notebook. Pressure increases where leverage exists. I closed the cover, turned off the light, and lay back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere above me, moisture spread slowly through drywall. Somewhere beyond this town, a review was unfolding that couldn't be smoothed over with favors or silence. I didn't know where it would end, but for the first time, I knew exactly where I stood. Not inside the circle. Not outside it either. Somewhere higher up, watching the structure show itself for what it was. And once a structure becomes visible, it can't pretend to be natural ever again. By the time the 3rd week after the hurricane began, the town had learned how to live with the waiting. Not my waiting. Everyone else's. Their houses were patched. Their claims settled. Their routines back in place. The conversations shifted from damage to decor, from insurance to landscaping. The storm became something that had happened, not something that was still happening. For me, nothing moved. My claim remained inactive. No denial, no approval. Just suspended in a status that didn't officially exist. When I called the general intake line, the representatives were polite but distant, as if speaking to someone already flagged in the system. "We don't have an update," they said. "We're still reviewing. You'll be notified." Each phrase sounded final without actually ending anything. At work, the audit deepened. The federal team expanded its scope beyond the immediate neighborhood. Adjacent towns, adjacent storms, adjacent years. The pattern didn't dissolve. It widened. It became clear that what I'd seen locally wasn't an anomaly. It was a method. Not one person orchestrating it. Not a single bad actor pulling strings. just a set of quiet preferences baked into process, reinforced by familiarity, and justified by the same sentence over and over again. This is how things work here. I logged in every morning and logged out every evening. I spoke to no one from home. I kept my notes precise. Emotion stayed out of it, not because I wasn't feeling anything, but because emotion didn't belong in the record. The isolation crept in sideways. Not dramatic. Not lonely in the way people talk about loneliness. Just the absence of friction that tells you where you stand with others. No one argued with me anymore. No one confronted me. They simply stopped acknowledging me as a factor. My ex stopped calling. His cousin stopped texting. The HOA emails continued without me. Planning a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate recovery. I watched the announcement circulate through forwarded screenshots like a ghost reading its own obituary. That was when the second kind of pressure began. Not from the town. From myself. Late one night, after finishing another set of reviews, I closed the laptop and stared at the wall. The house was quiet, except for the drip from the ceiling and the hum of the refrigerator. I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. What if nothing comes of this? What if the audit ends with recommendations instead of consequences? What if policies are adjusted, language softened, and everyone goes on exactly as before? What if the only real change is that I become permanently unhireable in the place I live? It wasn't fear, it was calculation. I ran through the scenarios the way I'd been trained to. Worst case, best case, most likely. In most versions, I lost. Not financially. I could manage that. Socially, this town had already decided what to do with me. The audit just gave them a reason to formalize it. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm and sat on the floor with my back against the couch, watching light creep in through the blinds. For the first time since the storm, I considered leaving. Not as a threat, not as a statement. As logistics, I could sell the house as is, take a loss, move inland, start over somewhere anonymous. Somewhere, my name didn't mean anything to anyone. The thought didn't feel like defeat. It felt like relief. That afternoon, the federal team scheduled another briefing. This one was different. More people on the line. Fewer pleasantries. The questions sharpened. They asked about local governance structures, about contractor rotation practices, about informal recommendations that never appeared in writing. I answered what I knew. I said I don't know when I didn't. No speculation. No storytelling. After the call, my supervisor sent a short message. We may need you to remain available beyond the initial review period. Available. The word hung in my mind longer than it should have. That evening, someone finally came to my house. Not a contractor, not code enforcement. A woman from the city's emergency management office. She stood on my porch, clipboard in hand, scanning the damage with practiced eyes. We're doing follow-ups, she said. Checking on unresolved cases. I nodded and let her in. She walked through the living room, the hallway, the kitchen, took photos, asked questions. Her tone was neutral, efficient. At the end, she looked up from her notes. This should have been addressed already, she said. I didn't respond. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. There's been some confusion. There it was again. Confusion. She left without making promises. But 2 hours later, my claim status changed. Not approved. Not denied. Under active review. It was the first movement in weeks. I didn't celebrate. I wrote down the time. The next day, the audit team requested additional documentation. This time, they wanted internal communications. Approval chains. Anything that showed how decisions moved from one desk to another. I provided what I had. And for the first time, I added context. Not personal. Structural. I explained how local relationships influenced contractor availability, how HOA recommendations shaped adjuster expectations, how urgency was framed differently depending on who was asking. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. Patterns speak for themselves. By Friday, the atmosphere shifted again. The town didn't know it yet, but the people who ran it did. Contractors stopped calling. Board members stopped knocking. The casual pressure evaporated, replaced by something colder. Distance. That night, as I walked my dog, I noticed lights flick off as I passed certain houses. Curtains drawn, conversations paused. I felt strangely calm. When people stop trying to change you, it means they've accepted that you won't. Back home, I opened the notebook and flipped back through the pages. The early entries felt almost naive now, as if I'd thought this was about being seen. It wasn't. It was about not being controlled. On Saturday morning, I received an email marked confidential. The federal team had identified discrepancies significant enough to warrant policy intervention, not disciplinary action, not charges. Intervention. The language was careful, legal, precise. Processes would change, oversight would increase, emergency clauses would require additional verification, contractor rotations would be standardized. No mention of individuals, no mention of blame, just correction. I read the email twice, then closed it. The victory, if you could call it that, landed quietly. No apology came with it. No acknowledgement from the town. My house was still damaged, my social standing unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted. The system had adjusted itself around the truth instead of bending the truth around itself. That afternoon, I packed boxes. Not in a hurry. Not emotionally. Just methodically. Books first, then clothes I hadn't worn in months. Then things that tied me to this place without giving anything back. As I worked, my phone buzzed. A message from my ex. "We need to talk. Things are changing." I didn't reply. I taped the last box shut and wrote my name on it in black marker. Ownership, again. That evening, I sat on the floor among the boxes and ate takeout from a place 2 towns over. The ceiling still dripped. The house still smelled faintly of damp wood. But the weight in my chest had lifted. I understood something now that I hadn't before. Justice doesn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as permanence. A change that outlasts the people who tried to avoid it. As the sun went down, I walked through the house one last time for the night, turning off lights that didn't matter. Tomorrow, the repairs would begin. Not because anyone had finally cared, but because the delay could no longer be justified. And soon, I would leave this place entirely. Not chased out, not in protest. Just done. Because once you see a system clearly, you don't owe it your presence. You owe yourself your exit. The repairs started on a Tuesday morning. No announcement, no apology, just a white truck pulling into my driveway at 7:12 a.m. The driver stepping out with a clipboard and a look that said he'd been told exactly what to do and nothing more. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't comment on the delay. He walked the house, took measurements, snapped photos, and made a call from the porch. I stood in the kitchen and listened to him talk in low, careful sentences, the kind people use when they know they're standing inside something bigger than they understand. By noon, the ceiling was marked for removal. I watched the first section come down in a cloud of dust, wet drywall collapsing into itself with a sound like surrender. It should have felt satisfying. It didn't. It felt administrative. That was when I realized I had crossed into a different phase of this story, one where outcomes arrived without ceremony and meaning had to be found elsewhere. I continued working the federal queue during the day and supervising repairs at night. The two worlds overlapped in strange ways. A contractor would ask about moisture mitigation while my screen displayed policy language about mitigation clauses. A hammer would strike a stud just as an email arrived about revised oversight protocols. Everything moved, but nothing touched. The town kept its distance. The HOA barbecue came and went without my name on the sign-up sheet. Photos appeared online, smiling faces, rebuilt decks, a banner reading "Stronger Than Ever." I saw my ex in one of them, standing at the edge of a group, hands in pockets, expression unreadable. I didn't feel anything when I saw it. That surprised me. One evening, after the crew left and the house fell quiet again, I sat on the floor amid the exposed beams and insulation. The place looked stripped down to its bones, honest in a way it hadn't been before. I opened my notebook and turned to the last page. For weeks, it had been my anchor, a place to put facts when emotion threatened to blur them, a way to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. Now, the pages felt finished. There was nothing left to add. The audit continued without me needing to push it. New teams took over. New analysts ran the numbers. The system corrected itself in small, permanent ways. I became invisible again. This time, by choice. On Thursday afternoon, my supervisor called. "We'd like to offer you a longer-term position," she said. "If you're interested." I asked her to explain. "Federal disaster review, permanent, remote with travel as needed. No local assignments in my current region." I laughed quietly. "Is that a condition?" I asked. "It's a protection," she replied. I told her I needed the weekend to think about it. That night, I walked the neighborhood one last time before the sun went down. People were outside again, watering lawns, unloading groceries, arguing gently over parking spots. Life had resumed its familiar rhythm. As I passed the community mailbox, I noticed the emergency contact list had been updated. My name was back on it, in the same handwriting as before, same curve to the letters. I stood there for a moment, reading it, then stepped back. It didn't feel like inclusion. It felt like correction. Someone had noticed an omission and fixed it, not because they'd reconsidered me, but because accuracy mattered again. I wondered who had made that call. I didn't wonder why. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since the storm. No spreadsheets, no numbers shifting in the dark. Just the sound of rain hitting the roof that was finally sealed. In the morning, I woke up with a clarity that surprised me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindicated. I was finished. I spent Saturday packing the last of my things. Not everything, just enough. The rest I'd deal with later, when the house sold. I listed it that afternoon. As is. Price to move. By Sunday evening, I had 3 offers. One was from an investor tied to the same contractor network that had benefited from the storm. I recognized the name immediately. I declined it without hesitation. The offer I accepted came from a couple relocating from out of state. No ties, no history. They asked practical questions and didn't flinch at the disclosures. I signed the paperwork and felt something loosen inside me. On Monday morning, I emailed my supervisor. I accepted the position. The response came back within minutes. "Welcome aboard." That was it. No speeches, no congratulations. Just a door opening somewhere quiet. Later that day, my ex called for the first time in weeks. I answered, mostly out of curiosity. "I heard you're selling the house," he said. "Yes." "And leaving?" "Yes." He hesitated. "You don't have to go." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I know," I said. "That's why I am." He sighed. "Things are calmer now. The audit's over. People are adjusting." "I know. As they sent of videos." "Then why?" I looked around the living room, at the exposed studs, the clean lines where damage had been removed instead of hidden, at the boxes stacked neatly by the wall. "Because calm isn't the same as fair," I said, "and adjustment isn't the same as change." He didn't respond. "I didn't do this to hurt anyone," I added, "but I'm not staying to make it easier to forget." When we hung up, I felt lighter. Not relieved. Resolved. The moving truck arrived 2 weeks later. I watched as my things were loaded carefully, labeled clearly, handled by people who didn't know my story and didn't need to. As the truck pulled away, I took one last look at the house. It would belong to someone else soon. Someone who might never know what had happened here. Someone who would step into a system that worked better than it had before. That felt like enough. I locked the door and left the keys on the counter, exactly where the closing instructions said to. No note. No message. Just completion. Driving out of town, I passed the HOA office. The lights were on. Cars filled the lot. Another meeting. Another agenda. I didn't slow down. On the highway, with the town shrinking behind me, I thought about everything I'd believed at the beginning of this. That fairness was automatic. That good faith was rewarded. That staying quiet kept you safe. None of that had been true. What had been true was simpler. Systems don't change because someone is right. They change because someone refuses to absorb the cost of being wrong. I merged into traffic and kept driving, the road stretching ahead, clean and unremarkable. For the first time since the storm, I wasn't waiting for anything. I was already gone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not the neighbors who watched the moving truck pull away. Not my ex, who stopped calling after our last conversation. Not even the few people who sent polite messages once the audit results became public in the vaguest possible way. There was nothing to explain. I drove inland until the air changed. until salt gave way to dust and pine, until the roads widened and the houses stopped facing the water like it owed them something. I rented a small place outside a mid-sized city, nothing charming, nothing temporary looking either. Beige siding, neutral carpet, a parking lot where no one watched who came and went. I liked it immediately. My new role started the following Monday. Same hours, same login time, different stakes. Federal work has a particular rhythm. Less urgency on the surface, more consequence underneath. You don't rush because you can't. Every decision lives longer than you do. Every adjustment ripples outward, touching people you'll never meet. I worked from a clean desk by a window that looked out onto nothing in particular. A strip mall across the street, a gas station, cars passing through without memory. At 7:30 a.m., the system logged me in. At 7:31, the first file appeared. Not from my old town, not even my state. A flood claim from the Midwest. Straightforward, no complications. I processed it carefully, methodically, and moved on. That was the pattern now. No overlap, no recognition, no subtle tests of loyalty. Just work. In the evenings, I unpacked slowly. One box at a time. Books went onto shelves in no particular order. Clothes stayed folded longer than they should have. I left the walls bare. I didn't need to mark this place yet. The first time I walked into a grocery store and didn't recognize a single face, I felt a quiet relief so strong it almost startled me. No history, no expectations, no role assigned before I spoke. I could stand in an aisle for as long as I wanted without it meaning anything. That was new. A week into the job, I received an internal update. The revised oversight protocols had gone into effect across multiple regions. Additional verification steps added. Contractor rotation rules enforced. Emergency clauses narrowed and clarified. It was dry reading. It should have bored me. Instead, I read every line. Not because it was about my past, but because it wasn't. The changes were systemic. They didn't reference the hurricane by name. They didn't reference my town at all. That was the point. The best corrections are invisible to the people who benefited most from the old version. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair. For the first time since the storm, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. That weekend, I took a drive with no destination. Just followed roads until they stopped interesting me, then turned around. I passed farms, outlet malls, a high school football stadium with a banner announcing the upcoming season. Life happening everywhere, unconnected to me. I didn't feel lonely. I felt unobserved. On Monday morning, my supervisor sent a message asking if I'd be willing to mentor a newer analyst, someone with solid technical skills but little field experience. I agreed. We met virtually later that week. She asked thoughtful questions, took notes, listened carefully. At one point, she hesitated. "Can I ask you something off the record?" she said. I nodded. "How do you know when something is actually wrong?" she asked. "And not just uneven?" I smiled slightly. "You don't at first," I said. "You know when the explanations start doing more work than the numbers." She wrote that down. After the call, I sat quietly for a while, thinking about how strange it was to be on this side of it. Not reacting, not defending, just passing something forward. The past didn't tug at me the way I'd expected it to. It stayed where it belonged. Occasionally, something would remind me a photo online, a mention in an article about post-storm reform efforts, a familiar contractor name popping up in a completely different context. Each time, the reaction was the same, distant, as if I were reading about a place I'd once visited but never lived. One evening, I opened the notebook for the first time since the move. I hadn't thrown it away. I wasn't ready for that. I flipped through the pages slowly. The early entries felt raw, close to the bone. The later ones steadier, more precise. The last page remained blank. I considered writing something. A conclusion. A lesson. Then I closed it again. Some things don't need to be summarized to be finished. That night, I slept with the window open. No generators, no dripping ceilings. Just the sound of traffic in the distance and wind through trees I didn't know the names of. I dreamed of nothing. In the following weeks, the job settled into routine. Files came in, files went out. Occasionally, a complex case required deeper review, A call, a second opinion. I handled them calmly, efficiently. No one questioned my presence. No one tested my boundaries. I was no longer an exception. That mattered more than I'd realized. One afternoon, an email came through marked, "For awareness." A regional government office had issued a statement acknowledging process improvements following federal review. No mention of favoritism, no apology, just progress. I forwarded it to no one. Instead, I went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet. Children rode bikes in the street. Someone watered a lawn too late in the day. Ordinary scenes, unremarkable. I stopped at a park and sat on a bench, watching people pass without thinking about how I fit among them. For years, I'd believed belonging was something you earned by staying, by adapting, by being useful in the right way. I understood now how incomplete that idea was. Belonging isn't about proximity. It's about alignment. And when alignment requires you to distort yourself, the cost accumulates quietly, until one day it's all you can see. I stood up and headed home, the path familiar now in a way the old town never had been. That evening, I finally unpacked the last box. At the bottom was the hoodie, the one from the contractor, still folded the way I'd left it. I'd forgotten it was there. I held it for a moment, then set it aside. I didn't donate it. I didn't keep it either. I dropped it into the trash chute without ceremony and watched it disappear. Then I washed my hands. Later, as I turned out the lights and settled into bed, I thought about the person I'd been before the storm. How careful she'd been. How willing to absorb discomfort to keep things smooth. I didn't miss her. I didn't resent her either. She'd done the best she could with the information she had. Now I had more. And that knowledge didn't make me powerful. It made me free. Whatever came next would be built on that. Not reaction. Not resistance. Just clarity. And clarity, I'd learned, travels well. The first sign that the review had moved beyond paperwork came quietly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. I was halfway through a flood reassessment from Missouri when a notification appeared at the top of my screen. No alert sound, no urgency flag, just a calendar invite added to my schedule without commentary. Interagency coordination. Attendance requested. I stared at it for a moment, then opened the details. No agenda, no list of participants, just a time and a secure link. That was new. In federal work, silence usually means one of two things. Nothing is happening, or something is happening very carefully. At the scheduled time, I clicked in. The screen populated slowly. Boxes appeared one by one. Faces I didn't recognize. Titles I did. Oversight, legal, external audit, 2 people from agencies that didn't normally share calls. No one asked me how I was. No one referenced the hurricane. They began with process. A summary of findings. A breakdown of deviations. Charts without labels that assumed a level of literacy you either had or didn't. I listened. About 15 minutes in, someone said my name. Not as an introduction. As a reference. As noted in supplemental materials provided by. They didn't finish the sentence. They didn't need to. The materials had become part of the record now. Detached from me. Useful on their own. That was the moment I understood the real shift. This was no longer about correcting a single event or region. It was about precedent. The call ended without conclusions, without next steps. That was how you knew it mattered. Afterward, I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall, letting the quiet settle. I felt nothing dramatic. No surge of validation. No anxiety spike. Just a steady awareness that something irreversible had been set in motion. Later that afternoon, I received an email marked Internal Distribution Only. The subject line read, Standardization Initiative, Draft. I opened it. The language was dense, deliberately so. Policy revisions framed as efficiency improvements, oversight mechanisms described as safeguards. But the effect was clear. The discretion that had allowed certain decisions to slip through unexamined was being narrowed. Not eliminated. Systems never give up power entirely but constrained. I read the document twice, then closed it. I didn't forward it. I didn't annotate it. I went back to work. That evening, something unexpected happened. I received a message from a number I didn't recognize. This is Karen from the city office. I'm not sure if you remember me. I did. She'd been the emergency management official who'd walked through my damaged house weeks earlier, clipboard in hand, eyes careful. She continued, I just wanted to say off the record that things are changing. It won't look like much from the outside, but it matters. I typed a response, then paused. What would I say? Thank you felt unnecessary. I settled on something simpler. I'm glad the work is continuing. She replied with a single word. Me too. I set the phone down and made dinner. It struck me then how strange it was that the most consequential moments of this process were happening without me being asked to perform anything. No testimony, no confrontation, no public reckoning. Just adjustment. The following week, the changes began to surface in subtle ways. A contractor rotation list was published, anonymized but unmistakable in its intent. A new verification step added to emergency claims, requiring documentation that couldn't be rushed or assumed. I noticed the language carefully avoided blame. That was intentional. Blame invites defense. Structure invites compliance. On Thursday, I saw a familiar name in a national database, one of the contractors who had appeared repeatedly in my early notes. Their approval rate had dropped sharply, not because they'd been flagged, because the process had changed around them. That night, I slept without dreaming again. On Friday, my supervisor scheduled a check-in. She didn't mention the call, or the initiative, or the documents. Instead, she asked me how the workload felt. Manageable, I said. Good, she replied. We value consistency. After we hung up, I sat quietly, thinking about that word. Consistency. It had been the missing piece all along. The system hadn't failed because it was malicious. It had failed because it was inconsistent in ways that aligned too neatly with power. Correcting that didn't require punishment. It required exposure. That weekend, I went back to the notebook. I hadn't opened it in weeks. When I did, the pages felt thinner than I remembered, as if they'd been holding their breath too. I flipped to the first entry. Dates. Times. My own handwriting, tense and compressed. I kept turning pages until I reached the middle, where the personal and the systemic began to overlap. Then the last entries. Calm and sparse. I closed it and placed it back on the shelf. I didn't feel the need to destroy it. I didn't feel the need to preserve it either. It had done its work. The following Monday, a public-facing statement was released. It didn't mention storms. It didn't mention audits. It spoke of process refinement and equitable resource allocation. The language was bloodless. The impact wasn't. I recognized it in the small details. The tone of incoming files. The absence of shortcuts. The way approvals took slightly longer, uniformly. Fairness, I'd learned, often looks like inconvenience. Midweek, a colleague messaged me. You might want to see this. She forwarded a local news article from my old town. The headline was bland. Something about updated disaster response protocols. The photo showed the community center. Fresh paint, new landscaping, no mention of names, no mention of delays. I scanned the article once, then closed it. I didn't feel compelled to share it. Or save it. The story wasn't for me anymore. On Thursday evening, as I was shutting down for the day, another message arrived. This one from my ex. The tone was different. No edge. No accusation. I didn't realize how much was happening behind the scenes, he wrote. I'm starting to see it now. I read it once. Then I replied, that's usually how it works. He didn't respond. I didn't wait for one. That night, I took a walk through my new neighborhood. The air was cooler now. Autumn edging in quietly, without announcement. Lights flicked on behind curtains. Someone practiced piano somewhere nearby. A dog barked once, then stopped. Nothing dramatic. I realized then that this quiet continuity was what I'd been working toward without knowing it. Not vindication. Not apology. Stability. A system that didn't depend on who you knew or how much patience you had for being overlooked. I stopped at a corner and looked back at the row of houses, identical and unremarkable. None of them knew me. None of them needed to. On the walk home, I thought about the people back in that coastal town, how they'd adjust to the new normal, how some would complain quietly, how others would never notice, how the benefits would be invisible to those who'd always had them. That was fine. Justice doesn't require applause. It requires durability. By the time I reached my door, the last light of the day had faded. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and turned on a lamp. The room filled with warm, even light. No shadows where I didn't expect them. No leaks. No waiting. I set my keys down and felt something settle into place. Not closure. Completion. The kind that doesn't announce itself. It just stays. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They surfaced in fragments, scattered across weeks, carried on phrases like restructuring, realignment, updated guidance, the kind of language that doesn't sound like anything until you realize how much has shifted underneath it. I noticed it first in the tone of incoming calls. Adjusters who used to sound rushed now sounded careful. Contractors who once assumed approval now asked questions. Files arrived with fuller documentation, slower timelines, fewer shortcuts disguised as efficiency. Nothing dramatic. Just friction where there hadn't been any before. One morning, I opened a file and paused when I saw the address. It wasn't mine, but it was close enough that I recognized the layout of the house from memory. The claim was ordinary. No flags, no urgency markers. The valuation sat squarely in the middle of comparable properties. That, more than anything, told me the change was real. Later that day, my supervisor sent out a general notice. No names, no acknowledgements. Please note that prior informal practices may no longer apply under revised protocols. Informal practices. That was the phrase they'd settled on. The next week, a contractor rotation update went live. The list was longer now, more evenly distributed. Familiar names appeared less often. Others, previously sidelined, began to show up. I watched the data adjust itself like a body relearning balance. Around the same time, I started receiving fewer messages from the past. No more forwarded screenshots. No more "thought you should see this" notes from acquaintances who didn't know what else to say. Silence returned, but it was a different kind. Not exclusion. Completion. Then, one afternoon, an email appeared in my inbox with a subject line that made me stop. Request for clarification. It wasn't from the federal team. It was from a regional office tied to my old town. The sender's name was familiar, a mid-level administrator who'd always been careful, always polite, always positioned just far enough from decisions to deny responsibility. The message was brief. They were seeking clarification on certain historical approval patterns and wanted to know if I'd be available for a short call. I read it twice. Then I replied, "I'm happy to answer questions in writing." The response came quickly. "Of course. We'll send them over." The questions arrived the next morning. They were specific, technical, focused on process rather than intent. How were contractors selected under emergency conditions? What criteria justified expedited approvals? How were conflicts documented and resolved? I answered each one carefully, citing policy language, timestamps, and publicly available guidelines. No speculation. No emotion. I sent the document back and closed the file. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from my ex. I didn't listen to it right away. When I finally did, his voice sounded unfamiliar, hesitant, stripped of the confidence that had once annoyed me. "They're changing things," he said. "At the board, at the city. People are nervous." He paused. "I don't think anyone expected it to go this far." I smiled slightly. Neither had I. I didn't call him back. A few days later, a small article appeared in a trade publication, buried on page 3, no photos. It referenced enhanced oversight measures following a federal review and noted that several municipalities were reassessing long-standing partnerships. One sentence stood out. No wrongdoing was formally identified, but procedural vulnerabilities were addressed. That was as close to acknowledgement as it would ever get. And it was enough. At work, the team shifted again. New hires brought in. Training modules updated. Mentorships formalized. The system was doing what systems do when they're forced to adapt, absorbing the change and pretending it had always been this way. One afternoon, the analyst I'd been mentoring messaged me. "I'm reviewing a case and something feels off. Can you take a look?" I reviewed it, pointed out a discrepancy, suggested next steps. She thanked me. No drama, no stakes. Just good work done quietly. That evening, I went for a walk as the sun set. The air had cooled, carrying the first real hint of fall. Leaves crunched underfoot. As I passed a row of houses, I noticed a moving truck parked at the curb. The logo on the side caught my eye. It belonged to a contractor who'd once dominated post-storm repairs in my old town. Now they were loading up. Relocating. I stopped for a moment, watching as furniture disappeared into the truck. A couch, a table, boxes labeled kitchen. No one looked at me. No one needed to. I kept walking. That night, I thought about how easily people mistake stability for innocence. How comfortable systems rely on the idea that nothing is wrong as long as nothing is loud. The audit hadn't exposed villains. It had exposed habits. And habits, once named, lose their power. The next week, my supervisor scheduled another check-in. This time, her tone was lighter. "We're seeing improvements across the board," she said. "Fewer anomalies, better documentation." I nodded. "We'd like you to help develop a training module," she added. Something on recognizing soft indicators. I agreed. Soft indicators. The things that don't break rules outright but bend them just enough to matter. As I worked on the outline, I thought about the early days after the storm, the vanished emails, the quiet reclassifications, the way my name had slipped off lists without comment. None of it illegal. All of it instructive. I built the module carefully, not as a warning, as a lens. At the end, I added a line I'd learned the hard way. If a process depends on silence to function, it isn't neutral. The module was approved without comment. A week later, it went live. On a Friday afternoon, as I was shutting down for the weekend, I received one final message from my ex. "I think I owe you an apology." I read it once, then I closed the app. Apologies, I'd learned, are often offered when they're no longer required. They come after the cost has been paid and the lesson absorbed. I didn't need it. That evening, I made dinner at home and ate at the small table by the window. Outside, traffic moved steadily. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed. Nothing about my life now was remarkable. And that was the point. I'd once believed that justice would arrive as a moment sharp, clear, undeniable. What I understood now was that real change rarely announces itself. It settles in. It changes the texture of things. It makes old shortcuts unusable and forces new habits to form. By the time anyone notices, it's already too late to go back. As I washed the dishes and turned off the light, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning. I hadn't been restored. I hadn't been redeemed. I'd simply stopped absorbing the cost of a system that required someone else to carry its weight. And in doing so, I'd helped tip it just enough toward balance. Not for me. For whoever came next, that was enough to let the night close in without regret. The moment that confirmed everything arrived without ceremony. No phone call, no headline, no envelope marked urgent. It came as a single line buried in a weekly internal update, the kind most people skim and forget by lunch. Effective immediately, Region 4 Disaster Response will operate under revised allocation authority, with local advisory bodies removed from prioritization decisions. I read it twice. Then, a third time. Local advisory bodies removed. That was it. No investigation announced. No individuals named. No corrective press conference. Just a quiet removal of discretion from the very place where it had done the most damage. I leaned back in my chair and let the words settle. This was the twist no one back home would recognize as justice. There would be no reckoning. No apologies. No public humiliation of the people who had benefited from the old system. No moment where anyone would have to say, "We were wrong." Instead, there would be something far more unsettling. Irrelevance. The boards, committees, and informal power centers that once decided who mattered during emergencies would simply stop being asked. They would still exist. They would still meet. They would still send emails and draft statements and reassure themselves that they were important. But the system would no longer bend around them. That afternoon, I received a forwarded message from a colleague in another department. Not gossip, just context. Apparently, several municipalities had pushed back hard against the change, requested exceptions, asked for clarification, raised concerns about local knowledge and community trust. The requests were denied. Politely, uniformly. The explanation was the same every time: consistency, equity, risk mitigation, language that left no room for negotiation. I closed the message and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Release. For weeks, I'd imagined that if this ever reached its conclusion, it would feel heavier, louder, charged with meaning. Instead, it felt like watching a machine shut off. The noise stopped. The next few days confirmed it. A contractor network once dominant in my old town was quietly removed from the preferred vendor list. Not blacklisted. Just no longer preferred. They could still apply. Still compete. Still win bids. They just wouldn't be waived through. An HOA in a neighboring county issued a statement expressing disappointment at the loss of local input. The statement was noted, archived, and ignored. No response was issued. I wondered how it felt on the other side of that silence. To be accustomed to influence and suddenly find it didn't register. To realize that the calls you used to make now ended in voicemail. To discover that the system no longer required your approval to function. That was the moral shift. In Ko Chuyen 1, justice had been intimate, personal, vindicating. Here, it was structural. No one was saved. No one was destroyed. The rules simply changed in a way that made certain behaviors ineffective. That was the kind of justice you don't recognize until you try to repeat yourself and nothing happens. On Wednesday, I received a message from Karen again, the city official. "It's official now," she wrote. "They've removed us from priority input." I won't lie, it's been uncomfortable. I considered my reply carefully. "Uncomfortable doesn't mean wrong," I wrote back. She responded a few minutes later. "I know. I just didn't expect it to feel like this." I didn't elaborate. She would understand in time. At work, the mood was calm, focused, almost relieved. The uncertainty that comes with transition had already been absorbed into policy. Someone asked during a team meeting whether we expected backlash. My supervisor answered without hesitation. "Possibly, but consistency tends to outlast resistance." I wrote that down. Not in the notebook, I no longer needed that, just in my head. That evening, I went for a long walk through my neighborhood. The same route I'd taken dozens of times now. The gas station, the park, the stretch of road where traffic thinned and thoughts had room to move. I thought about my old town, how the people there would frame this. They would say the storm had taught hard lessons, that mistakes were made, that procedures had been updated. They would never say favoritism. They would never say exclusion. And they would certainly never say my name. That was fine. This ending didn't belong to me. It belonged to the next person who would file a claim after a disaster and be judged only by damage, not by proximity or pedigree. It belonged to the family whose house sat at the edge of town, not the center. It belonged to the woman whose name wasn't on any list but still needed help. That was the ethical difference. Justice here didn't restore a wronged individual. It removed the conditions that made the wrong inevitable. On Friday, my supervisor sent a short message. "You did good work. This will matter longer than you know." I appreciated the sentiment, but I didn't linger on it. Good work isn't supposed to echo. That night, I unpacked the last box. Inside were things I'd deliberately avoided touching: old photos, a couple of framed certificates, the spare set of keys to a house that was no longer mine. I sorted through them calmly, kept what still felt like mine, let go of what didn't. At the bottom of the box was the notebook. I hadn't planned to keep it, but I didn't throw it away either. I placed it on the shelf, spine outward, unmarked, a record of something that didn't need to be repeated. The following Monday, an internal announcement went out welcoming several new hires from regions that had been under-resourced in previous disaster responses. I read the list of names and felt something like hope. Not the bright, fragile kind. The steady kind that comes from knowing the structure has changed. Later that day, my ex tried calling again. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. I didn't feel compelled to listen to the voicemail this time. There was nothing left to explain. He lived in a world that had assumed permanence. I now lived in one that understood revision. That night, as I prepared for bed, I thought about the version of justice I'd once expected. The apology, the recognition, the moment of acknowledgement that would make the pain make sense. I smiled softly. Those are comforts. Not corrections. What had happened here was something harder and better. No one had been forced to admit wrongdoing. They'd been forced to operate without it. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of a city that didn't know my story and didn't need to. Tomorrow, more files would arrive. More decisions would be made. Fairly. Consistently. Without regard for who knew, whom, or how things used to be done. That was the ending. Not satisfying in the way stories promise, but durable. And durability, I'd learned, is the truest measure of justice there is. The story didn't end with a goodbye. There was no final walk through a familiar place, no lingering look back, no moment where I felt the need to mark the ending with something symbolic. When the work changes the system instead of the people inside it, closure doesn't arrive as a scene. It arrives as absence. Weeks passed. The files kept coming. Floods in the Midwest, fires out west, tornado damage across the plains, different disasters, same procedures. The revisions held. The safeguards stayed in place. No one tried to undo them. That was the final confirmation. At some point, my old town stopped appearing in my thoughts altogether. Not deliberately, not with effort. It simply lost relevance, the way a former address eventually does. You remember it when prompted. Not because it's still shaping your days. One afternoon, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd checked local news from there. I didn't miss it. My life now was defined by steadiness. Morning routines. Work that asked for my attention but not my loyalty. Evenings that ended without replaying conversations in my head, without wondering what I should have said differently. That kind of quiet takes practice. I learned to enjoy small things without assigning meaning to them. Cooking dinner without multitasking. Letting a book sit unread on the coffee table for days. Walking without tracking steps or time. Nothing was urgent. That, too, felt earned. At work, the training module I'd helped develop became standard. New analysts referenced it casually, the way people do with things that have always existed. No one associated it with me. That was exactly right. One morning, I was assigned a claim from a coastal town that reminded me too much of the one I'd left. Similar layout, similar demographics, similar language used in early assessments. I read the file carefully. The damage was moderate, the documentation complete. The approval fell exactly where it should. No shortcuts, no delays. I processed it and moved on. The system worked. That evening, I stopped by a bookstore on my way home and picked up a notebook. Same size as the old one, same black cover. When I got home, I placed it on the shelf next to the first. Empty. I didn't open it. It wasn't there to record damage. It was there in case I ever needed proof again. That need might never come, but knowing I could respond if it did, that mattered. Every so often, someone from my past tried to re-enter the frame. A former neighbor sent a friend request I never accepted. An old acquaintance forwarded an article about disaster funding reform with a note that read, "This sounds familiar." I didn't reply, not because I was bitter, because the conversation had already moved on. One evening, while cleaning out an email archive, I came across the message that had started everything, the one that labeled me a conflict, and quote. I read it once, then deleted it. No ceremony, no anger, just housekeeping. The following weekend, I drove out of the city and spent the day somewhere anonymous. A stretch of road with nothing but trees and sky, no landmarks, no stories attached. I parked, stepped out, and stood there for a while, listening to wind move through branches I didn't recognize. I thought about how much energy I'd once spent trying to understand why certain things happened to me, why exclusion took the forms it did, why fairness seemed to depend on proximity instead of principle. I didn't wonder about that anymore. Understanding the system had answered the question. It had never been personal. And once something stops being personal, it stops owning you. That realization changed how I saw everything else. Work was work. Relationships were choices, not obligations. Belonging was alignment, not endurance. On Monday morning, my supervisor sent a brief message announcing a new regional expansion. More analysts hired, more oversight built in from the start. She ended the note with a line that caught my attention. We're designing these processes to last beyond us. Beyond us. That was the point I'd been circling without naming. Justice that depends on one person's presence isn't justice. It's temporary relief. What lasts is structure. What lasts is the quiet removal of incentives that allow harm to repeat itself unnoticed. Later that day, I received a message from the analyst I'd mentored months earlier. "I handled my first independent audit today," she wrote. "Caught something subtle. Thought of you." I smiled. Not because she'd thought of me. Because she wouldn't always need to. That evening, I cooked dinner and ate at the table instead of the couch. Outside, the city settled into night, sirens in the distance. A train horn somewhere far off. Life continuing. I realized then that the most radical thing I'd done wasn't staying quiet, or documenting, or leaving. It was refusing to internalize a system's failure as my own. Once I stopped doing that, everything else followed naturally. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need acknowledgement. I didn't even need the people who'd excluded me to understand what they'd lost. They hadn't lost me. They'd lost control over a process that no longer needed them. That was enough. Before bed, I stood by the bookshelf and looked at the two notebooks side by side. One full, one empty. I left them there and turned off the light. In the dark, I felt no urge to revisit the story, to replay it with different outcomes or sharper lines. It had resolved itself in the only way that mattered. The system now behaved differently than it had before I'd noticed it. Someone else, someday, would benefit from that without ever knowing why. That was the quiet legacy of this story. Not a warning. Not a lesson. A correction that didn't ask for gratitude. As I lay down and closed my eyes, I felt something simple and complete. Not triumph. Not peace, even. Just the absence of strain. The knowledge that I no longer had to prove anything to belong anywhere. I belonged to myself. And the world, for once, had adjusted accordingly.